Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and for today's card, I decided I wanted to make a 1-layer watercolor card. So I started off with a large sheet of Canson XL watercolor paper that I had trimmed down to 4 1/4 by 11 inches, and then I'm scoring it at 5 1/2 inches with my Teflon bone folder, and I just lined it up in my Fiskars cutter and used the cutting groove to make my score line. And I'm using my Teflon bone folder and really pressing this crease down because Canson, this watercolor paper is quite heavyweight. I would compare it to actually a little bit heavier weight than like the 110-pound Nina Solar White that I normally would use for my card bases. So my idea for this card was I wanted to stamp on the outside and the inside of the card and do some watercoloring. And that's what prompted me to create the entire card out of watercolor paper, because rather than, cutting pieces of it and then layering it on the outside and on the inside, it was like, might as well make the entire card out of watercolor paper and save myself like all the extra bulk. Plus I wanted to try it and see how it would look. So I've got the Simon Says Stamp Stacking Animals stamp set here, and I wanted to create, a stack of all these little animals. So I kind of lined them up on my card front just to see how this was going to look. And then I'm using my Misty for this. It's not necessary to use the Misty. I just thought, since I was stamping on watercolor paper, on the off chance if I didn't stamp an image perfectly, I could obviously re-stamp it with the Misty and not mess up. But I ended up finding everything stamped really well on this. But I got my card lined up in the Misty, and then I start lining up my little images. I treated the cardstock with my anti-static powder tool first, which for this wasn't really necessary because I'm handling the card a lot, like moving the stamps around, touching it, everything else. So I found the more I use my powder tool really liberally with this. And then I'm stamping. I stamped the first image with Simon Says clear ink, and I started from the bottom because for me, I found that to be easier to line everything up. Looks wise, it honestly, in the end, it probably would have worked to start from the top and work my way down just for the way everything is kind of basically masked off, if that makes any sense. But really, I don't care. I found that there was just one of those little things where it's like, it probably would have looked a little better to have like from the top down rather than the bottom up, just the way the images stack. Yeah, if that makes any sense. If not, it doesn't really matter. But I stamped and embossed the little alligator first, and then I went on and stamped the largest turtle from the set, and stamped it, poured on the embossing powder, and before melting it, I just used a little paintbrush to wipe off the bottom areas of where the turtle's feet were, so that the alligator, the top of him, wasn't covered by those feet, because otherwise you're going to have like multiple lines, and it's just going to look messy. So I did that. Then heat the embossing powder on the turtle, and then just keep repeating this process. So I will go back, treat the cardstock with my anti-static powder tool, and then this time I stamped the elephant, covered it with the embossing powder, and then again used that little paintbrush to wipe off any little areas that were overlapping the image below. So I just do this over and over and over again, and once I got my little system going, it became easier and easier to do. So I finally did the giraffe last, and I knew his head was going to peek up over the top, so I wanted to make sure that didn't get stamped on what will be the back of the card. So I grabbed a sticky note and just masked off from the fold line of the card up, and then I stamped the giraffe, did the same thing, coated it with the embossing powder, and then before melting it, I just wiped off the bottom of his feet that overlapped the elephant below him, then heat that with my heat tool. So I've got all of the outside stamped. Doesn't really look like much because it's white on white, but it will in a minute. And then I wanted to finish the inside. So same thing, I'm just treating it with my anti-static powder tool. And then I need to get the bottom of the card lifted this time because I wanted to stamp that giraffe again, and it's a large stamp. So once I was happy with the placement, I could get that stamped. So I stamped it so the giraffe's head starts at the bottom. And then I'm going to stamp the little birds. I was only originally going to do like the small bird, but then I was like, I've got space and I want to use like all the images in this set because they're adorable. So I grabbed the little larger bird and lined him up on top of the giraffe's head. Did the exact same thing, just over and over again. Stamping, pouring on the embossing powder, wiping off any of the areas that overlap with my little paintbrush. I also used the paintbrush to wipe off if the embossing powder was sticking to areas that weren't stamped. And then once I got the large bird, I'm going to stamp the little smaller bird on top of his head. Do the exact same thing. Coat it with the embossing powder, wipe off that little excess with my brush, and then finally the last little image is this tiny little mouse in the set. So line him up on top of the bird's head, got that stamped, and then I'm going to emboss it, and that finishes off all of the embossing for all these images. So then once I'm done with all the heat embossing for my coloring, I'm using the Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. I've been getting a lot of questions lately, like what type of papers do I recommend to use with this? This is one of them. I've used this multiple times. The Canson XL watercolor paper. I really like how these markers just blend on this watercolor paper. I find that they blend really easily. I feel like I don't have to move as quickly. I know a lot of people really love the Strathmore Bristol Smooth, which I've used, and I do recommend that one as well. I do find with the Bristol Smooth, personally, I have to move a little bit faster before marker lines get created or anything like that, if that makes any sense. Whereas with the Canson XL watercolor paper, I find I can even go back and re-wet areas and rework them if I want with these markers, and I don't have a problem. So it's just up to personal preference. I find with the Zig Clean Color, I prefer more often to use watercolor papers like this Canson XL, and another good one is Strathmore Ready Cut watercolor paper. I've used that in a previous video as well and linked to it, and I really, really like that. The Bristol Smooth, it just depends on my mood, honestly. I get asked that a lot, especially with like, methods of coloring that. It literally just depends on my mood. But for these markers, I really like this specific watercolor paper, and it's cheap watercolor paper, which to me is always a bonus. So I can always experiment and I don't feel guilty. So I just did pretty basic coloring for the most part. With the giraffe, I did end up like Googling images of giraffes just to kind of make sure I got their, you know, spots right so it didn't look really ridiculous. And I didn't do much layering of color other than on that turtle shell there. I layered a few different colors together. But generally, when I'm coloring with these markers, I don't usually do anything fancy. I just apply color and then pull it out with my water brush, and that's it. Like, I find the markers just blend really nicely, they move really nicely, and I don't have to put in a ton of effort. And I'm just using my tiny little H2O water brush. It has a really fine tip on it, and I find that's good. And you'll actually see me in a minute here. I'm going to use it to even do like the background and shading around all these images as well. That's what I always reach for with these markers, is this little water brush, and it just works fabulously. So I just go along and add all my color. I never worried about taping down this card or anything like that because I'm not adding a bunch of water. So the warping is fairly minimal. In fact, most of the warping on this card was created just from the heat embossing, so I don't really worry about it. So once I was done coloring all the images, I added a really, really pale blue to their eyes because that's the one thing I noticed, like the eyes really just kind of faded into the card, and I will deal with that in a minute as well. And then I also wanted to add a little bit of shading around the stack of animals, again, just to make that embossing pop a little bit more and give it that bit of definition. So I will have a picture on my blog of all the different colors I used. And this one was called Mauve. I think it's called Mauve Shadow. It was just perfect. Like, the name of it was perfect and the color was perfect. Just a really pale, almost purplish blue. And I just went along the outside edges of the animals with the marker and then just pulled it out with my water brush so it faded to white. Just gave it that little extra bit of definition to make the lines pop. And then once I was done all that, that's when I realized I was like, the eyes still, like, you can see them here. They just don't really look like anything. They almost look like little like zombie animals or something, which would work depending on the occasion. But I wanted their eyes to show up, so I went in and painstakingly, like, I sped this up. This is like the watercoloring, and this part is about 8 times faster than it took. But I carefully went around their little pupils with the markers, and I didn't watercolor it. I just drew straight with the marker. And then I took my water brush and just kind of wiped off any of the marker that went over the embossing so that it was still like crisp and white. And that's what kind of finished off these animals and just gave them that little bit of character and a little bit more definition. So I just used various markers of the same colors that I already used on the other images to finish off their eyes. And yeah, really simple, and it just completed that. And I was originally going to stamp the sentiment directly onto the card, but I thought I would just stamp it onto the scrap of black cardstock instead, just to make it pop a little more. So I quickly just lined that up into my MISTI and then coated the black cardstock with my anti-static powder tool. And the sentiment is from that same Stacking Animals set. So it says, "I've got your back." That's what inspired this entire card. So stamp that onto the cardstock with the same Simon Says clear ink. Use the same detail white embossing powder. Tapped off the excess there into my coffee filter, and then I don't show it on camera, but I just use the coffee filter to funnel it all back into the container. And I'm going to heat that with my heat tool, and then once the embossing powder is melted, give it a couple seconds to cool off, and then I just rub my hands really well on the black cardstock to remove all of that anti-static powder because it leaves that kind of white cast on darker cardstocks. So once I've got that removed, I can grab my paper trimmer again and trim this down. And I just use the little wire guide in my paper trimmer to trim it down and line everything up. So I realized the one side was a little too wide compared to the other. So I just quickly line that up again in my trimmer. And then I always hold down the edge of the trimmer there so that it doesn't shift when I trim off like really small pieces. And then to adhere that to my card, I just popped it up on some foam tape and that finished off the card. I decided to keep it really simple, no other embellishments, just let it be basically a one-layer card. So as always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have links to the supplies used, a picture of all the colors I used of the markers, and you can check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching, subscribing, thumbs upping, and commenting on my videos, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!